The day the sky burned was the day Earth learned it was not alone in the universe. Ships darker than night descended through the clouds. They were massive, each one larger than any city humanity had ever built. The people of Earth looked up with wonder and fear. They did not know that their freedom had only hours left to live. The Vethkai came first. They were tall creatures with bodies like insects, covered in hard shells the color of dried blood. Their eyes saw only profit in the small blue planet. They had traveled across the galaxy looking for workers, for bodies that could survive harsh conditions, for slaves. When they scanned the humans below, they found exactly what they wanted. Within 1 week, Earth fell. Human weapons meant nothing against shields that could stop nuclear fire. Human armies crumbled against soldiers who had conquered 100 worlds. The Vethkai did not come to negotiate. They did not come to trade. They came to harvest. The first ships left Earth carrying 10 million people. Men and women packed into cargo holds like animals. Children separated from parents and marked with brands that showed their value. The Vethkai were miners, and they needed workers for the acid pits of their colony worlds. Human skin burned in those pits. Human lungs filled with poison. But humans could work for years before they died, and that was enough for the Vethkai. But the Vethkai were not alone in their hunger. The Aurelian. Dominion arrived 6 months later. They were beautiful in a terrible way, with skin like polished silver and eyes that glowed soft blue. The Aurelians could read minds and control thoughts. Every species they touched became their puppet. But humans were different. Human minds were loud, chaotic, filled with strange emotions the Aurelians could not fully grasp. They could read human thoughts, but not control them completely. This made humans valuable in a different way. The Aurelians took them as pets, as entertainment, as challenges. Wealthy Aurelian families paid fortunes for human servants whose minds they could not break. It became a game to them. How long until the humans surrendered? How much pain before the wild thoughts went quiet? The Kreth Empire came next. Massive reptilian warriors who stood 3 meters tall and lived only for battle. They had no interest in mining or pets. They wanted fighters. Human gladiators became famous in their arenas. Small, weak, fragile compared to other species, yet somehow they kept winning. They fought with a desperation that other slaves could not match. They fought like creatures with nothing left to lose. More species followed. The Syndicate of Yol used humans for medical experiments, testing drugs that would kill other races. The Collective of Tharn used them as translators. Since human brains could learn new languages faster than any other known species, the merchant clans of Rossi traded them like currency. Moving human cargo from one end of the galaxy to the other, Earth became a farm. The great cities were torn down and replaced with breeding facilities. Human children were born, raised until they were old enough to work, and then shipped away to masters they would never escape. Families existed only until the next ship arrived. Love was a luxury that slaves could not afford. 300 years passed, generations lived and died in chains. Children were born who never knew what freedom meant. The word Earth became a myth, a story that old slaves whispered to young ones. Some said it was a paradise where humans once ruled themselves. Others said it never existed at all, but the masters made a mistake. They thought that broken spirits could not remember. They thought that slaves who had never known freedom would not dream of it. They looked at humans and saw only tools, only resources, only bodies meant to serve. They did not see the fire that still burned in human hearts. On a frozen moon called Keth-9, deep beneath the surface, where Vethkaya acid mines poisoned the air, a woman named Sira Vance pressed her back against the cold stone wall of a tunnel. She was 40 years old, born in the mines, daughter of miners, granddaughter of miners. She had never seen a sky without poison clouds. She had never breathed air that did not burn her throat. But she had heard the stories. Every human in the galaxy had heard them. Stories of Earth. Stories of freedom. Stories of a time when humans chose their own paths. These stories passed from parent to child, from worker to worker, in whispers too quiet for masters to hear. The stories were the one thing the Consortium could not take away. Sierra reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. It was a transmitter, stolen piece by piece from Vethkai communication equipment. Dozens of workers had died to gather these parts. Hundreds more had worked in secret to assemble them. This tiny machine represented centuries of hidden resistance. Around her, 1,000 workers waited in silence. Their faces were scarred from acid burns. Their hands were rough from endless labor. Their eyes held a light that their masters had never noticed. Today was the anniversary of first contact. 300 years to the day since the Vethkai ships had first appeared in Earth's sky. On every world where humans lived as slaves, small groups gathered in secret. In mining tunnels and factory basements, in servant quarters and gladiator cells, humans waited for a signal. Sierra activated the transmitter. Her voice was calm, but her heart beat fast enough to burst. Prometheus is rising. The message traveled through hidden networks that spanned the galaxy. It bounced from satellite to satellite, from system to system, reaching every corner of consortium space. On 1,000 worlds, humans heard those words and understood. The waiting was over. In the Aurelian court of High Prince Vethros, a serving girl named Mira smiled as she poured her master's wine. She had served him for 20 years. He thought she loved him. He was wrong. In the Kreth arena, on the world of Kreth Prime, a gladiator named Marcus lowered his weapon and looked at his opponent, another human slave. They nodded to each other. Today they would not fight for alien entertainment. In the Vethkai breeding facility on Earth, workers stopped their machines. Guards shouted orders. The workers did not obey. For the first time in 300 years, humanity stopped obeying. The consortium believed that 3 centuries of slavery had broken the human spirit. They believed that generations born in chains would never dream of freedom. They believed that, scattered across 1,000 worlds, humans could never unite. They were wrong about everything. The chain of masters had held humanity prisoner for 300 years, but chains can be broken. And humanity had spent every single day of those 300 years learning exactly how to break them. The sky above, Keth-9 was filled with Vethkai patrol ships, confident in their power, blind to the danger rising beneath them. In the mines below, Siravance led her people toward the surface. Toward stolen weapons. Toward a war that would shake the galaxy to its core. The stars had watched humanity suffer in silence for centuries. Now, they would watch humanity rise, and the stars would turn red. The admirals of the Absortium laughed when they received the reports. Slave uprising. They had heard these words before. Every few decades, some group of workers would find courage and try to fight back. It never lasted more than a few days. The consortium had crushed 100 rebellions across 1,000 years. Hi. Admiral Vethker of the Vethkai extermination fleet did not even consider this a real mission. He gathered 30 warships and set course for Keth-9, where the rebellion had started. His orders were simple: kill enough humans to remind the rest of their place. Burn the mining facilities if necessary. The slaves could be replaced. They always could be replaced. The journey to Keth-9 took 3 days. During that time, Admiral Vethker received more reports. Other uprisings had started on other worlds. Humans in the Aurelian courts had attacked their masters. Gladiators in Kreth arenas had turned on their guards. Workers in Yol laboratories had destroyed research equipment. Still, the Admiral was not worried. These were isolated incidents. Slaves had no way to communicate across star systems. They had no weapons worth fearing. They had no ships, no technology, no military training, or so he believed. When the extermination fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Keth-9, Admiral Vethker expected to see a frozen moon and perhaps a few stolen mining vessels trying to escape. What he saw instead made his blood freeze colder than the moon itself. A fleet was waiting for him. Over 200 ships hung in the darkness of space. They were strange vessels, built from pieces of mining equipment, cargo haulers, and transport ships. They were ugly, uneven, covered in welded patches and exposed machinery. But they were armed, and they were positioned in a perfect battle formation. Admiral Vethker had only seconds to wonder how this was possible. Then the human fleet opened fire. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Vethkai shields were designed to stop energy weapons. But the human ships fired physical projectiles. Massive chunks of asteroid rock accelerated to incredible speeds. The shields could not stop them. Warships broke apart under impacts that hit harder than any weapon the Vethkai had ever faced. Admiral Vethker sent a desperate message to Consortium Command before his flagship was torn in half. His last words were a warning that no one would understand until it was too late. They knew. They knew everything about us. The humans did know everything. For 300 years, humanity had not simply suffered. They had learned. Every species that enslaved them had also taught. Them without meaning to? Humans who served Vethkai engineers had watched them work and memorized every detail. Humans in Aurelian households had listened to conversations about military secrets and trade routes. Gladiators trained by the Kreth had mastered combat techniques that no human had ever known before, and they had shared their knowledge. The Prometheus network had been built in secret over 2 centuries. Trusted humans on every world passed information through hidden channels. A mining technician on Keth9 would send details about Vethkai's shield frequencies. A servant on an Aurelian estate would report the location of patrol fleets. A gladiator would describe Kreth battle tactics. All of this information flowed to the network, where it was collected, organized, and studied. By the time the uprising began, humanity knew more about the Consortium's weaknesses than the Consortium knew about itself. Commander Syrah Vance had spent 15 years preparing for this moment. She had never held a weapon before the uprising began, but she had studied military strategy from stolen files. She had learned ship combat from simulations hidden in mining computers. She knew the names and positions of every Consortium fleet in this sector. When her fleet destroyed the Vethkai extermination force, it was not luck. It was 300 years of preparation meeting 11 minutes of fury. News of the victory spread faster than the Consortium could contain it. On every world where humans worked as slaves, the message arrived like a spark touching dry wood. The great Vethkai fleet destroyed. Human ships victorious. Freedom was possible. The uprisings multiplied. On the Aurelian world of Velthius Prime, a human woman named Mira led 200 servants in a revolt against High Prince Vethros. The Aurelians could read minds, but they could not read the minds of 200 people all thinking different things at once. The chaos of human thought became a weapon. By the time Aurelian guards understood what was happening, Myra had seized the planetary communications center and broadcast the coordinates of Aurelian military bases across the galaxy. On Kreth Prime, the gladiator Marcus led an army of fighters out of the arena and into the streets. The Kreth were powerful warriors, but they had spent generations fighting for entertainment, not survival. The human gladiators fought with a desperation the Kreth could not match. They had nothing to lose. They had everything to gain. The Consortium called an emergency meeting. For the first time in centuries, the great powers of the galaxy spoke with fear in their voices. How is this possible? The Aurelian representative demanded. They are primitives. They have no technology of their own. They have our technology, the Vethkai ambassador replied, his voice bitter. We gave it to them. We forced them to build our ships and maintain our weapons. We taught them everything they needed to destroy us. The Kreth warlord slammed his massive fist on the table. Then we destroy them completely. Every human in the galaxy? We burn them until nothing remains. But it was already too late for that. Commander Vance's fleet had grown. Every victory brought more stolen ships. Every liberated world brought more soldiers. Humans who had been scattered across the galaxy for centuries were finally coming together. They communicated through the Prometheus network, coordinating attacks across impossible distances. Within 1 month of the Keth9 victory, 17 slave worlds had been liberated. Human forces had captured 3 Vethkai shipyards. They had destroyed the Aurelian mine-breaking center on Velthus Prime. They had freed 100,000 gladiators from Kreth arenas. The Consortium sent larger fleets. They sent their best admirals. They sent weapons designed to wipe out entire populations. None of it mattered. The humans knew every tactic before it was used. They knew every weakness in every ship design. They had spent 3 centuries watching, learning, and waiting. Now, they used every lesson their masters had taught them. Commander Vance stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching another consortium fleet burn in the darkness of space. She thought of her grandmother, who had died in the acid mines before Cyril was born. She thought of her mother, worked to death before her 40th birthday. She thought of every human who had suffered and died while the galaxy looked away. A communication officer approached her with a message. It was from the consortium, requesting negotiations. Sarah did not even consider it. "Send them our response," she said. 3 words. "You taught us." The message was transmitted across all frequencies. The consortium heard it and finally understood the truth. Every cruelty they had inflicted, every lesson they had forced humans to learn, had become the weapon of their destruction. For 300 years, the galaxy had seen humanity as nothing but slaves. Now they would learn what slaves could become when they finally broke their chains. The war was only beginning, and humanity intended to finish it. Admiral Chen Wei had spent the first 30 years of his life in the fighting pits of Kreth Prime. His body was covered in scars from battles. He had won. His mind was filled with memories of friends he had watched die for alien entertainment. When the uprising began, he had led 1,000 gladiators to freedom. Now he commanded the Second Liberation Fleet, and he had developed a new way to fight this war. He called it the Crimson Doctrine. The traditional rules of warfare said that you should destroy your enemies quickly and completely. The Kreth had taught him this in the arena. Kill fast. Show no mercy. Leave no survivor to seek revenge. But Admiral Chen had learned something else in those years of blood and pain. He had learned that fear could be a more powerful weapon than any gun or bomb. And he had learned that guilt could destroy an enemy from within. When human forces captured enemy commanders, Admiral Chen did not execute them. He did not torture them for information. Instead, he showed them the truth. The Prometheus Network had not only gathered military intelligence, it had also gathered evidence. For 300 years, humans had recorded their suffering. They had hidden cameras in mining facilities. They had stolen files from breeding centers. They had collected testimonies from survivors across the galaxy. Now, Admiral Chen used this evidence as a weapon. The first commander to face the Crimson Doctrine was High Inquisitor Velthros of the Aurelian Dominion, the same prince whose servant Myra had led the uprising on Velthes Prime. He was captured when his escape ship was disabled by human fighters. He expected to die. He was wrong. Instead, human soldiers brought him to a small room with a single screen. For 3 days, they made him watch recordings. He saw Aurelian masters beating human servants for small mistakes. He saw human children separated from their parents and sold to different owners. He saw the mind-breaking centers where Aurelians had tried to destroy human will through years of mental torture. He saw humans die. He saw them suffer. He saw them beg for mercy that never came. On the 3rd day, Commander Sarah Vance entered the room. She stood before the Aurelian prince, her face calm, her eyes cold. "You thought we were animals," she said. "You thought we existed only to serve your pleasure. Now you have seen what your pleasure cost us." High Inquisitor Velthros could not meet her eyes. For the first time in his long life, he felt something he had never experienced before. Shame. "Go home," Commander Vance told him. "Tell your people what you saw. Tell them what is coming if they do not surrender." They released him. They gave him a ship and let him fly back to Aurelian space. When he arrived, he was a broken creature. He stood before the Aurelian Council and spoke for 7 hours, describing everything he had witnessed. He wept as he spoke. He begged his own people to end the war before humanity's vengeance consumed them all. Half of the Aurelian Council voted to surrender that same day. The Crimson Doctrine spread through the human fleets. Every captured enemy officer faced the same treatment. They were forced to confront the reality of what their species had done to humanity. Some went mad from guilt. Others returned to their homeworlds and became advocates for peace. A few took their own lives, rather than live with. What they had learned, the psychological effect on the consortium was devastating. Species that had seen humans as nothing but property suddenly had to face 3 centuries of recorded cruelty. They could not deny it. They could not pretend it had not happened. The evidence was too complete, too detailed, too overwhelming. The Syndicate of Yole was the next to break. They had used humans for medical experiments, testing chemicals that caused slow and painful death. When human forces approached their homeworld, they received a transmission. It was a list of names. 18 billion names. Every human who had died in Yole captivity over 300 years, compiled by survivors with perfect, terrible patience. At the end of the list was a single message. We remember all of them. Do you? The Syndicate surrendered without a single shot being fired. But not all species were willing to face their guilt. The Vethkai refused to accept defeat. They were proud, ancient, convinced of their superiority over all other races. When their commanders were captured and subjected to the Crimson Doctrine, they returned home not with shame, but with rage. The humans seek to humiliate us, the Vethkai Queen declared. They seek to make us feel guilt for using resources as resources were meant to be used. We will not submit to this manipulation. She ordered her remaining fleets to gather for one massive assault on the human liberation fleet. Every Vethkai ship that could still fly was called to service. They would crush this rebellion or die trying. Commander Vance received word of the gathering fleet. She did not hesitate. If they want a final battle, she said, we will give them one they will never forget. The 2 fleets met above Veth Prime, the ancient homeworld of the Vethkai species. The Vethkai had numbers on their side, 300 warships against less than 200 human vessels. But the humans had something the Vethkai could not match. They had rage that had been building for 300 years. The battle lasted 6 hours. Human ships dived into the heart of the Vethkai formation, striking at command vessels and breaking their coordination. Admiral Chen Wei led his gladiator fleet in a direct assault on the Vethkai flagship. His ships took terrible damage, but they did not retreat. They did not know how to retreat. They had been trained to fight until victory or death. Victory came at a terrible cost. 40 human ships were destroyed. Thousands of liberated slaves died in the fire of combat. But when the smoke cleared, the Vethkai fleet was broken. Their flagship drifted dead in space. Their queen was captured, brought before Commander Vance in chains. What do you want? The queen demanded. Revenge? We can pay tribute. We can give you planets. Name your price. Commander Vance shook her head slowly. You still do not understand. This was never about price. This was about justice. She gestured to the view screen, which showed the Vethkai homeworld below. Fires burned across its surface, where human ground forces had landed. Not to destroy, but to liberate. Thousands of human slaves still lived on Veth Prime, and they were being freed even as the Queen watched. You looked at us and saw resources, Vance said. Now look at your burning sky and see what resources can become. The Queen had no answer. The war had a name now. Across the galaxy, free humans and enslaved ones alike spoke of it in hushed and hopeful voices. They called it the Crimson Reckoning. The time when humanity finally made the galaxy answer for 3 centuries of cruelty, and the reckoning was far from over. Commander Sira Vance had expected many things when her fleet approached the Morvathi refugee stations. She had expected resistance. She had expected traps. She had expected another battle in a war that seemed to have no end. What she had not expected was a welcome. The Morvathi were small creatures, barely reaching human chest height, with gray skin and large dark eyes that had seen too much sorrow. They had once ruled a mighty empire that stretched across 300 star systems. That was 3,000 years ago, before the consortium had conquered them. Now they lived in refugee stations on the edge of known space. Servants to masters who barely remembered they existed. When the human liberation fleet arrived, the Morvathi did not run. They did not fight. Instead, they sent a single ship forward. Carrying a delegation of their elders, the eldest of them, a Morvathi named Kreeth, stood before Commander Vance on the bridge of her flagship. He was old, his gray skin wrinkled, his movements slow, but his eyes held a light that Vance recognized. She had seen that same light in the eyes of every freed human slave. "We have watched your war," Elder Kreith said. "We have seen you do what we dreamed of doing for 3,000 years. You fight as we always wished we could fight. You remember your pain and use it as strength." He lowered himself to one knee, a gesture of respect that clearly pained his ancient body. "Teach us," he said. "Teach us to remember our own rage." Vance stared at him in silence. She had spent so long fighting alone, leading humans against the galaxy that had enslaved them. She had not considered that other species might share their pain. "Stand up," she said finally. "We do not kneel to each other. Not anymore." She reached down and helped the elder to his feet. In that moment, something new was born. The coalition of the condemned began with the Morvaith, but it did not end with them. Word spread quickly through the galaxy's hidden channels. Other species that had suffered under the consortium heard that humanity was not only winning, they were accepting allies. The Kel came next. They were beings of living crystal, their bodies shimmering with inner light, their minds connected across vast distances. The consortium had never enslaved them directly. The Kel could not be used as workers or servants, but the consortium had isolated them, cut them off from trade and travel, left them to slowly fade on their dying homeworld. "We did not support slavery," the Kel speaker explained through thoughts that appeared directly in human minds. "For this crime of conscience, we were condemned to extinction. If you will have us, we will share our knowledge," and what knowledge they had. The Kel had spent millennia studying the universe. Their mathematics was beyond anything humanity had ever seen. Their understanding of physics made consortium technology look primitive. When Kel scientists began working with human engineers, miracles started to happen. Ships that could travel faster than ever before. Shields that could stop weapons that once seemed unstoppable. Communication systems that let the Liberation Fleet coordinate across the entire galaxy in real time. The Durrani joined next. They were tall beings with 4 arms and skin that changed color with their emotions. Once they had been great explorers, the first species to map most of the galaxy, then they had refused to participate in the slave trade, and the consortium had dismantled their empire piece by piece. Admiral Chenwei welcomed them personally. "You have experience we need," he told their leaders. "You know these stars better than anyone. Help us find every hidden base, every secret route, every place where slaves are still held." The Durrani provided maps that the consortium had tried to destroy. Star charts showing forgotten routes. Locations of prison worlds that did not officially exist. With this information, the Liberation Fleet could strike at targets the consortium thought were safe. More species joined. The Thren, whose natural healing abilities made them valuable in treating wounded soldiers. The Vox, whose ability to mimic any sound made them perfect for disrupting enemy communications. The Krell, massive beings of living stone, who had been forced to work in construction until their bodies crumbled. Each species brought something unique to the coalition. But more importantly, each species brought their own rage, their own memories of cruelty, their own desire to see the consortium fall. Commander Vance stood before a gathering of coalition leaders. Looking at faces that represented a dozen different species, a year ago, she had led a rebellion of desperate slaves. Now she commanded an alliance that stretched across the galaxy. The consortium believed they were untouchable, she said. They believed they could crush any resistance, absorb any rebellion. They were wrong. They made enemies of every species they ever hurt. Now those enemies stand together. The Morvathi elder Kreith spoke next. "For 3,000 years, my people waited for someone brave enough to strike the first blow. Humanity struck that blow. Now we strike together." The Kel speaker added their crystalline voice to the chorus. "Alone, each of us could be broken. Together, we are a force the consortium cannot stop." The war changed after the coalition formed. What had been a desperate rebellion became a systematic campaign of liberation. Human tactics combined with Kel technology and Durrani knowledge created strategies the consortium could not counter. World after world fell to coalition forces. not through destruction, but through liberation. Slave populations of every species rose up, supported by human networks that had spent centuries building connections. The Kreth warlord, who had once commanded gladiator arenas, now faced armies of former gladiators fighting alongside Morvathi freedom fighters and Durrani scouts. The Aurelian Council watched their influence crumble as coalition ships freed the servants they had treated as property. In a consortium council chamber was no longer safe from attack. The remaining leaders spoke in fearful voices. "They are not just defeating us," a Vethkai admiral admitted. "They are unifying everyone we ever oppressed. Every species we conquered, every race we exploited, every people we dismissed as lesser beings. The humans are bringing them all together, and we must destroy the humans completely," another leader suggested. "Without them, the coalition will fall apart." But they had tried to destroy humanity. They had sent their greatest fleets. They had used their most terrible weapons. And still, humanity survived. Still, humanity fought. Still, humanity grew stronger. Commander Vance received intelligence reports showing that the consortium was planning one final desperate attack. They would gather every ship they had left and strike at Earth itself, the symbolic heart of human resistance. The world where all of this had begun. She smiled when she read the reports. Let them come. Let them see what their former slaves had become. Let them see the coalition waiting for them. The stars had watched the consortium rule through fear for millennia. Now the stars would watch that rule end. Humanity had lit a fire that could not be put out, and that fire had spread to every corner of the galaxy. The final battle was coming, and the coalition of the condemned was ready. Earth hung in the darkness of space like a blue and green jewel, scarred but still beautiful. 3 centuries of exploitation had left marks on its surface. The great cities that humanity had once built were gone, replaced by breeding facilities and processing centers. The forests had been cut down for resources. The oceans had been polluted by alien industry. But Earth was still home. It was still the world where humanity had been born. And today, it would be the world where humanity's freedom was finally secured. Commander Stevant stood on the bridge of the Unbroken Will, the flagship of the Coalition Liberation Fleet. Through the view screen, she could see the largest gathering of ships in galactic history. Human dreadnoughts built in the forges of liberated worlds. Morvathi carriers that had waited 3,000 years for this moment. Kel consciousness ships that hummed with unified purpose. Durrani scout vessels that had mapped these very stars in ages past. And 10,000 smaller ships, crewed by freed slaves of every species, all flying under a single banner. That banner showed a broken chain wrapped around a rising sun, the symbol of the coalition of the condemned. Across the system, the consortium fleet was gathering. Vethkai warships that had once terrorized 100 worlds. Aurelian command vessels carrying the last of their mindbreakers. Kreth battlecruisers crewed by warriors who had sworn to die rather than surrender. And ships from a dozen other species, all united in one final desperate attempt to crush the rebellion. Admiral Chen. Wei's voice came through the communication system. They have 4,000 ships. We have 6,000. For the first time in this war, we have the advantage. Commander Vance nodded, but her expression remained serious. Numbers are not everything. The consortium is fighting for survival. They will be desperate. They will take risks they would never normally take. Then we will be ready for them, Chen Wei replied. His gladiator fleet was positioned on the left flank, ready to strike at the heart of the enemy formation. After 30 years in the fighting pits, he knew how desperate enemies fought. He had been one of them. The consortium fleet began to move. They came in waves, trying to overwhelm the coalition defense lines with sheer numbers. Vethkai ships led the charge, their acid weapons burning through space. Behind them, Kreth battlecruisers pushed forward, their crews howling war cries that echoed across communication frequencies. The coalition did not waver. Kel crystal ships created defensive barriers that absorbed the first wave of attacks. Durrani scouts identified weak points in the enemy formation and transmitted coordinates to the main fleet. Human gunners, trained on weapons they had once built for their masters, opened fire with deadly precision. The battle lasted 7 hours. Ships burned and broke on both sides. Coalition vessels sacrificed themselves to protect troop transports carrying liberation forces to Earth's surface. Consortium commanders threw their ships into suicidal attacks. Hoping to break through the defensive lines, Admiral Chenwei led his gladiator fleet in a direct assault on the Consortium flagship, a massive Vethkai dreadnought called the Eternal Dominion. His ships took terrible damage. Dozens were destroyed. But the gladiators did not retreat. They had been trained to fight until the end. And for the first time in their lives, they were fighting for something that mattered. The Eternal Dominion fell after 2 hours of continuous combat. Its destruction sent shockwaves through the Consortium fleet. With their command ship gone, their coordination began to fail. Ships that had been working together started acting independently, making them easier targets. Commander Vance watched the battle turn in their favor. She had dreamed of this moment for her entire life. She had been born in the mines of Kethnine, daughter of slaves, granddaughter of slaves. She had never known freedom until she fought for it. Now she was watching the empire that had enslaved her people crumble before her eyes. But she did not feel joy. She felt only a heavy sadness for all those who had not lived to see this day. Her mother, her grandmother, billions of humans who had died in chains while the galaxy looked away. Commander, a communication officer called out. The Consortium is sending a surrender signal. They are requesting terms. The bridge fell silent. After 3 years of war, after 3 centuries of slavery, it was over. Vance closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her voice was steady. Tell them we accept their surrender. No executions. No revenge killings. Their ships will be disabled and their crews taken prisoner. They will face justice, but they will receive mercy. Some of her officers looked surprised. They had expected vengeance. They had expected humanity to treat its former masters the same way humanity had been treated. Vance understood their surprise. She felt the anger too, the desire to make the Consortium suffer as humanity had suffered. But she also remembered something her grandmother had told her, words passed down through generations of slaves. We will not become what they made us. We will not let their cruelty turn us into monsters. When we win, and we will win, we will show the galaxy what humanity truly is. Coalition ships moved forward to accept surrenders and rescue escape pods, even enemy escape pods. Consortium crews who had expected death found themselves being pulled from the wreckage by the same species they had enslaved in the years that followed. The Galactic Compact replaced the Consortium. It was built on principles that the old rulers would never have accepted. Every sentient being was declared free. Slavery was abolished across the galaxy. Trade and travel were open to all species equally. The coalition species worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed. Kel technology helped restore damaged worlds. Durrani explorers opened new frontiers for settlement. Morvathi healers tended to the physical and mental wounds left by centuries of cruelty. And humanity took its place among the stars, not as slaves, but as liberators. Not as victims, but as leaders. On the anniversary of Liberation Day, a monument was unveiled in the capital of the New Earth. It stood in the place where the largest breeding facility had once operated. Now transformed into a park of remembrance, the monument was simple. A tall spire of white stone reaching toward the sky. It listed no names. There were too many names to list. Billions of humans had lived and died in slavery. Their individual stories could never all be told. Instead, the monument bore a single inscription, carved in every language of every species that had joined the coalition. We were broken. We remembered. We rose. And we made certain no one would forget. Commander Sierra Vance, now President of the Human Republic, stood before the monument as crowds gathered for the ceremony. She was older now, her hair gray, her face lined with the weight of all she had seen and done, but her eyes still held the fire that had burned in the mines of Kethnine. She thought of her grandmother, who had died believing that freedom was impossible. She thought of her mother who had whispered stories of Earth to a young girl who had never seen the sky. She thought of every human who had kept hope alive through centuries of darkness. "We did it," she whispered. "We finally did it." Above her, the stars shone peacefully. But humanity knew the truth. Those stars had been turned red by the fire of liberation. They had witnessed the fall of an empire that had believed itself eternal. They had watched slaves become warriors, victims become liberators, chains become weapons. The galaxy had learned what happened when you underestimated humanity. It was a lesson that would never be forgotten, and the stars remembered.